Data. It's everywhere. So what do we do with all this information? And how do we use it better for our teams, for our businesses, and for our clients? And how do we use it fast while it's still relevant in real time? This week's podcast is all about data analytics, but from an unusual perspective, because we'll discover what the sports betting industry can tell us about getting data, using data, and asking data the right questions. And we'll talk about the potential opportunities for accounting and finance professionals that this could offer. So, coming up, how sports analytics could improve your business.
Hello. I'm Kyle Hannon. I'm based in the AICPA and SEMA office in the heart of London's financial district. And our expert guests are Dr. Jason Imbrogno, the Assistant Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics and Finance at the University of North Alabama, and Dr. David Bergman, also an Associate Professor of Operations and Information Management at the Department of Operations and Information Management at the University of Connecticut. Our guests join us from what for them is their lunchtime. Jason, where are you joining us from? Your office? Are you out in a green quadrangle on a campus somewhere?
No, I'm sitting in my office, although the semester's over, so there's no students around.
Oh, that's a good thing. So, David, is it as quiet where you are?
It is. I'm actually at the University of Connecticut's downtown Hartford office, which is a little bit more of an urban setting than the standard University of Connecticut kind of green pasture university setting.
Okay. So we know where you are. Let's figure out why you're here on the podcast. You're both business school professors. You published a sports analytics article last year regarding the NFL, the National Football League survivor pools. You've got another paper on daily fantasy sports strategies that's under review with additional co-authors. And you're actively working on 3 other sports analytics research streams, including optimizing selections for the NCAA basketball tournament, which predicts opponent participant strategies in daily fantasy sports, and you correctly predict and rank NFL game outcomes. Now, 2 threads tie these research streams together: sports gambling and the amazing and increasing amount of data available in the field, and using multiple entries to achieve low probability, high payoff outcomes. The interesting thing here is that daily fantasy sports provides millions of new data points every day. And that means you're on the cutting edge of using this data effectively in an academic setting. And in addition, as an external advisor of McKinsey and Company, David, you've seen that companies are spending a lot, resources, attention as well, to access data that improves their operations. In fact, you and Jason have a very strong grasp of the data that's generated on a daily basis for all interested parties, and that's bettors, that's betting platforms, sports leagues, database managers, predictive analysts, broadcasters too. You understand how to obtain and apply lessons learned from that data to different settings. So that's why in this podcast, we're looking at showing the size and the potential of the sports analytics industry and how you can apply the lessons there to many other lines of business. So, gentlemen, what have I left out? What are you both working on at the moment? How does it connect with the accounting and finance professions? Jason, let's start with you.
Sure. So you mentioned basically one of the important threads that ties a lot of our research together is the idea of using multi-entry strategies. So you have sort of a bunch of chances, a bunch of tickets, a bunch of entries that you use. And instead of thinking of them as independent bets, you basically think of the collective whole. And you're really concerned with trying to get one of them to be a really high outcome. So the most obvious application I think that this has for the finance profession is when you think about a venture capital firm who, may invest in 100 different companies, all with a relatively low probability of success, each one separately. But if one of them does explode, you invest in the next Facebook, you become, a millionaire, a billionaire overnight. And so the strategies that we employ in daily fantasy sports, in survivor pools, in our NCAA brackets are things that are especially useful outside of sports analytics in the finance profession when you think about venture capital.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that and also give another example. So I gave a presentation to the finance department here at UConn a couple months ago. And one of the interesting ties that they identified was actually the relationship between daily fantasy sports and the Morningstar ranking for mutual funds. So a goal for a mutual fund investor frequently is to get on this Morningstar list. And to do so, you have to be in the top X% of all mutual funds that are registered with them. And so if you think about the question that is asked of those fund managers, it's select a series of investments so that against everybody else you do towards the top. And they saw the exact parallel with the work that we're doing, because if you think about daily fantasy sports, where you're selecting a collection of players so that they as a group perform very well, and also they perform very well compared to the collection of players that other entrants into the competition choose, you get a very similar decision-making environment.
David, plug us into your world for a minute. What does your typical 9 to 5 look like when you step into the world of perhaps sport or business? Who do you engage with, and what pivot points do you typically focus on?
Yeah, I guess I would say there's no typical. So I may start with what's atypical. I mean, most of my time I spend in academia, right? Teaching classes in analytics and automated large-scale decision-making. And so that's typically, you teach a class. Sometimes you have students coming over for office hours. And then other days, I'm working more in consulting, and I work with clients across the board, right? So one of them that I've recently worked, through McKinsey, I work with lots of different companies. I focus a bit in the public sector, but also have worked with banking clients, mining clients, and other clients. And so those days are much different, right? Wake up early, get on the grind, and start working. But there is a common thread that in the morning, I start looking at daily fantasy sports competitions. I find the ones that I'm going to target. I start to think about buying into those competitions. And then typically around 5 o'clock, I take a little detour towards grabbing as much data as we typically grab to make our decisions, running models and getting the lineups basically ready for 7 p.m. and sometimes later competitions.
Jason, do you have a typical 9 to 5?
Well, I mean, I would say no, but I think that's probably true for most academics, like David said already. A lot of my time here at work is teaching and interacting with students, but then my time away from the classroom, away from the students, is spent on research, and specifically these recent streams that David and I have been working on with the sports analytics.
So let's switch focus from what you may do from the 9 to 5 and let's look ahead. The reason you've joined us on this podcast is because we're looking at how sports analytics can improve a business. So why is this worth looking at? What is the disruption that shows what something like daily fantasy sports can tell us? What kind of insight does it give us on how to gauge and evaluate the future of our business? What's just changed?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can take a first crack at that, and then Jason, please do follow up. And I think one of the main things is the integration of machine learning and optimization. So machine learning has been around for a while, even though it just became popularized recently. And what machine learning models do is they provide you an excellent prediction for the future. Counter that with optimization. What optimization has generally been applied to is automating large-scale decision-making decisions. And so, for example, looking at an airline and trying to figure out what crew should be assigned to which flight, and lots of different kind of large-scale decision-making environments. I think what's interesting about sports betting is it's a perfect framework or a perfect field for investigating new techniques for integrating the two. Because you have to definitely build a machine learning model for how good the players are going to do. How good is a team going to do? How is that team's performance going to change throughout the season? But then you also have to make optimal choices. What are the collection of players I'm going to choose? What are the teams I'm going to choose this week for a survivor pool? What are the teams I'm going to pick for March Madness? And so you get this really interesting integration of machine learning and optimization, and that has fueled a lot of my academic research on the integration of the two. I have a new solver called Janos, Janos, which provides, from my understanding, the first ever tool available for integrating machine learning and optimization in one solution platform. And a lot of that stemmed from the questions that I was thinking about in sports gambling, because really it's a problem that you have to have really good prediction for and very advanced optimization techniques for.
The other thing that's really nice about how daily fantasy sports help sort of in this arena, David and I aren't finance or accounting professors or professionals, but obviously as business school professors, we're at least familiar with the fields. But for accounting firms, you come out with, say, a quarterly statement on earnings and profits and whatnot, right? Well, with daily fantasy sports, literally daily, you're getting thousands and thousands of new data points regarding how players performed, how your collection of players that you chose on your entry performed, which players other people that you're competing against chose, and how your collection of players chosen on your entry performed against those other entries. So in other words, you're getting a ton of data and a ton of results, every day that become useful, especially, again, if you're familiar with machine learning at all. Basically, the more information you can feed the algorithm, the better it gets at predicting. And so it's a really, again, a disruption that's being caused because we're able to really fine-tune these models much more quickly than you might see in other fields where the data generation process itself has a really long lag time.
I love that. And I'll just add that, daily fantasy sports, at least in the high-end competitions, you're typically playing against the same people night over night. And so you have to react extremely quickly to what competitors are doing. And I think with this, a digital age that we are already very deep into, I think that's decision-making that all businesses have to handle.
As someone who is not a sports fan, I get into sports because there are other things going on the peripheries. There's a prospect of having a barbecue at the side of the sports field. That's why I'm there. If it's a sunny day and there's a chance of having something refreshing in a bottle, that's why I'm there. Great conversations with friends. And the sports is almost an aside. So, I'm there at the sports event, but that's not what sparked my interest. And I'm assuming that you gentlemen are completely different. Was it sports that brought you in? Was it business? Was it the interest in the technology? Jason, what got you into this area?
Yeah, certainly it was just interest in sports and sports gambling in the first place. I'm pretty sure it was at my house when David visited about 3 or 4 years ago that we initially started thinking about these types of projects. But yeah, it mostly stems from mutual interest in sports, again, in the first place. But the other thing that's nice, like I said earlier, you've got this data that keeps being generated day by day. Another nice thing, so a lot of previous work that I've done is in education policy evaluation. A big problem or a big wall sort of that you have to get through with ed research is you can't have identified data. Whereas in sports, it doesn't matter if we know the player's name. So there's a big problem with using personally identified data in a lot of other areas, especially in economics research, in education, in healthcare, even in labor outcomes, that just doesn't come out when you're talking about sports analytics. Nobody cares that we know who the players' names and what their stats are, because that's all just publicly identified information anyway. So it was an interest in sports, a realization that data was sitting there, and a realization that we could really apply a lot of the techniques, a lot of the models that we know in our fields to the questions that are afoot in the analytics area here.
And David, was sports your entry as well?
Yeah, so I've always liked sports growing up. It was always just an interest of mine. Also because there were fun barbecues that you could run to and different tailgating events, but also got into sports and following different teams, right? I remember even as a kid, we would watch the New York Knicks together, my family and I. And anyway, always had kind of like an affinity for sports. But I think, it was like a perfect storm, right? So Jason and I, both technically deep people, really just interested in finding a new playground of math. And then we started having a conversation and said, this appears to be a really perfect setting to apply high-end analytics. And, the whole thing just came together.
Fascinating. So let's put things into wider context here. And I think I'll ask you this one, David. If you think about the wider world where I'm from, I know about betting on things, the concept of having a wager. It's not something that everyone does, but pretty much everyone in business will be familiar with the expression spreading your bets. Now, I know that's a concept that works in sports betting. It also, as you said, it works in investments. It works in any large business with a portfolio of potential operations and opportunities to generate revenue. And you certainly can't talk about rewards without talking about the flip side. And by that, I mean the risk. So, David, let's ask you to start with that. What does daily fantasy sports gaming tell us as business people about identifying, assessing, and managing risk?
It's such an interesting question because I find kind of a dual problem in sports betting to what you might find in standard investment, which is in investing, you typically try to maximize your expectation or return and minimize your risk as much as possible. On the flip side, in daily fantasy sports, you're definitely, of course, looking to maximize your expectation, but you're also trying to maximize your risk because you are willing to take a gamble on not winning today as long as you hit it big one time out of X amount of times in the long run. And I think Jason's parallel with venture capitalist investing was a great one, because this might be a strategy that someone might employ. So you invest in 100 different opportunities, none of them work out, but then you're a founder of Facebook, right? And so I think thinking about decision-making in a betting context is something very similar to what might be done for venture capitalists.
Normally, I would say most people's working definition of risk would be, I do something that has a small chance of succeeding, say a 10% chance of succeeding. And if I run that same game 10 times, hopefully one of them hits. What we're trying to say here is, in these multi-entry strategies that we design in these various contexts that we've implemented them, we are acknowledging a purposeful loss on many of our entries. And so I think the best answer I have to the question about managing risk is sort of a rethinking of what risk means by viewing the whole portfolio itself instead of each individual entry. So in other words, when we set up entries in a daily fantasy sports competition, we are hoping that 9 out of 10 of them do horribly. Because we know that the model that we've created, the algorithm we've generated to pick these teams, purposefully plays the entries off of each other. And so the only way to get one of them to do really well is for the other ones to do really poorly. And so I think that's just a different understanding, a different thought process of risk than what you might typically have. We want to lose some of our entries purposefully.
So let's keep an eye on risk and reward. We know in business these days, it's normally a focus on Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. There's always this avoidance of risk, the worry about its impact on share value or perception in the media, or people seem to be losing courage when it comes to business these days. But I think sports tells us how to adopt a different mindset. How could businesses use this different approach to risk and reward to improve the way they look at what's ahead and the way that they measure their results? I mean, practically, how can they use this to drive them forward into 2020? Jason, why don't you take a shot at that?
One of the things that we see in playing daily fantasy sports on any of the platforms that we use is that you may have something like 1,000 entries in a competition. And the top performing entry wins a huge pot, and then it quickly sort of descends from there. And so coming in that first place out of 1,000 is super important, but you have to get a really, really far outlier result to do that, because again, everybody's playing the same game. Everybody's also going for that pot. But where I think that sort of mentality can apply and help businesses is, instead of such a focus on these small downside risks, realizing how important a huge upside win could potentially be. So to tie into sports again, thinking about swinging for the fences, for example, worrying more about a type of sort of very low probability but high payoff, what we might call like a black swan event that would be beneficial for you, instead of ignoring that, instead of saying, well, that's such a low chance of occurring, I don't want to focus any of our strategy around that. Realizing that a real game changer of a change in a business operation, change in a company that you invest in, whatever, can have a potential huge impact. If you're playing daily fantasy sports and you come in first place in a competition, that can fund entries for the next month. And so you get a lot of leeway, a lot of benefit from this one outlier outcome.
David, Jason there mentioned a black swan event. What is that?
Yeah, so that's something that really is something unexpected that might not be easily predicted. For example, in football, a fourth string wide receiver scoring 2 touchdowns in a game. Very few people will pick that individual, but if you have that individual on one of your entries, you will do really well. And I think I can draw a parallel with a railway car manufacturing company I just had a conversation with. And what they do is they basically are one of the biggest manufacturers of rail cars, and some rail cars have to be fitted to have certain characteristics so it can carry particular types of load. And one of the major things that they're struggling with is that on occasion, some commodity dips really quickly in price or raises really high in value. and they don't have enough of the cars compatible with that particular commodity to sell to the people that want to move it. And so this is very similar, right? You want to predict this kind of black swan event that all of a sudden this commodity is going to be super important for the market, and you want to make sure that your rail cars are able to carry those loads. And I see it as very similar as picking a not so good player in a daily fantasy sports setting who generally won't do so well. And if they don't do that well, you're not going to win on that one of your multi-entries. But should they do really well, you're going to end up near the top.
Well, that certainly tells me something I didn't know. I've never heard of a black swan event, but now that is all changed. And this is not too far from what we're talking about. It's an ever-changing landscape, new technologies, disruptive platforms, data analytics, and the way that we treat the data, what we do with it, and how we care for it, always important. How's it sourced? How's it evaluated? How's it used? If you look at your sports research, tell us about the central problem in all of this, because there's so much information. You were talking about thousands and thousands of data points that you have to go through. Isn't it possible that you lose sight of the bits that we should be paying the most attention to? Jason, how do we move on something when we have more than we know what to do with? I'm talking about data, info beast. If we've got so much, can we see the wood for the trees?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the million-dollar question, I think, moving forward for a lot of businesses right now who are able to record and store data, but don't have the capability of analyzing it quickly to make good informed business decisions. So again, one of the advantages of the daily sports context is that we get all this data every day, but what do we do with it? How do we actually choose to make good decisions going forward with it? And I mean, the best way I can explain how sort of an iterative process brought us to better understanding of how to do this is when we started working on this problem, we thought our objective function was to maximize the variance between our entries. So in other words, think about in the extreme, say you have a 2-entry model. You want one entry to come in first place and the second entry to come in last place. That would be a fine outcome in a daily fantasy sports competition. It would be a fine outcome in venture capitalism, right? Well, what we quickly realized was that we were getting pretty good variance between our outcomes, but we were never getting quite that top outcome. And so we were really losing money for a little while. We would score something like a 25th percentile and a 90th percentile. Well, the 90th would lose. The 25th percentile might win, but it wouldn't win enough money to cover both. And so we were losing money. We quickly realized we're solving the wrong problem. And we really need to just solve, our goal is to maximize profit. We've got a cost to these entries. We've got an expectation on how they'll do. We've got an expectation on how the collective set will do, not just each individual one. And we know what the payoff structure looks like. And so instead of just worrying about trying to spread the scores of our entries, we really worried about, let's try to get one of them really, really high, because that's the best way to maximize your profit.
So, David, just to elaborate on that, when you talk about what the sports betting industry can tell us about coming up with the right questions, what's your take on how that can be improved or just made easier with more data that we have?
I was a panel leader recently for a leadership conference, and in the panel we had the CMO of Priceline and also Senior VP of Analytics at Travelers, right? And the name of the panel was, "You've got mountains of data. Now what can you do with it?" And I think what's interesting is that maybe like 95% of data in the world is never even read by a program. It's just stored somewhere. And I think that starting to tap into that can find relationships in your data that you never knew even existed. And then it can have you ask questions about where can you drive efficiency. So I think going back to your previous question on, how do you kind of keep your mindset straight with all the data that's coming at you? I think a related thing is just how do you use the mountain of data just to explore it, just to find an interesting trend? And I think that all companies are struggling with this these days.
The question is, how do they do that? Obviously, you've got technology which can do all sorts of things. And behind every successful technology, we believe, lies a good algorithm. So what makes a good algorithm? With your experience, could either of you give us an example to demonstrate the crossover of what makes a good algorithm which applies in the world of business?
I'll try to take a quick crack at that. I think it's got to be efficient, and it has to answer the right question. So, we do have tons of computational power these days, and computers run extremely quickly. They get double as fast every year. But even so, there are problems that are way past the computational power that we have right now. And so efficiency, I think, is so important, because if you don't have efficiency, no one's going to sit in front of a computer as a business decision-making individual and wait for something to run for hours and hours and hours. Generally speaking, they want to see a quick solution, and they want to see it right away. Number two, it's got to answer a question. I think a lot of people are entering data scientist roles out of school, and they just do analytics to do analytics. I also think some companies come to analytics professionals and they say, can you please go find that red button on your computer that says machine learning and optimization and click it and then have all the efficiency in the world? And that's just not how it works, right? You got to be answering a interesting question. And so, those are the two ways that I would answer that. Another related objective of an algorithm that makes it really powerful is that it solves multiple questions. I would say that, in the work that Jason and I have done, two of the bodies of work, one on NFL survivor pools and one on daily fantasy sports, both of them are applicable to the domain of daily fantasy sports or survivor pools, so sports betting, but they're also applicable elsewhere. Survivor pools, for example, it's very related to kidney matching. So in an NFL survivor pool, what you have to do is each week of the NFL season, pick a team. And if that team wins, you go to the next week. If that team loses, you don't go to the next week. But you can never pick the same team twice. If you think about kidney matching, what happens is that you have donors and recipients. And you need to tie and link every donor to a potential recipient. And you have a certain probability of that match being good or bad. And so you get exactly the same setting as you have in a survivor pool, where you don't know that team A is going to win in week 5 of the NFL season. You just have a probability of that working. And so every single week, every single team, you have this probability, just like every single donor, every single recipient, you have a probability of it being a match. And you want to optimize your decisions based on those probabilities. And
with a key idea that the probabilities update each week. So you can think of it in the kidney matching example, the probabilities updating as you, get blood tests on the people to see their compatibility.
Yeah, anything where you get more information about what the potential match between the donor and recipient will be. And as time goes, that the clarity on the probability becomes more readily accessible and accurate. And I think also for the daily fantasy sports, one thing that it's very related to is operations optimization. So in daily fantasy sports, you want to pick a collection of entries, one of which does very well. Oftentimes in, for example, machine scheduling, or in assignments of projects to teams, you want to assign those projects so that you're able to complete all your projects as quickly as possible. And so you get this kind of break up the objects that you need to create so that you complete all of them by a certain threshold as quickly as possible, just like in daily fantasy sports. So to answer your question, Kyle, I think a good algorithm has got to be efficient. It has to answer the right question. But to have an exceptional algorithm, that must be something that is applicable across multiple domains.
And we'll continue that conversation shortly as we discuss some more practical steps to look at data analytics and what the analysis of that data in the context of the sports betting industry can help us discover opportunity in business. You're listening to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more about this podcast and about the rest of our wider project at gobeyonddisruption.com. This episode is all about sports analytics, how sports analytics can improve your business. And we are talking to Dr. Jason Imbrogno and Dr. David Bergman, both of them business school professors who know about much more than just business school stuff. They know about sports, which I'm glad about because I know nothing, which is why I have two experts along. So let's look at those experts and see what Jason and David can tell me about what is happening now in a kind of a practical way. David, what industries are springing up to support this sector? Because there must be all sorts of opportunities for accounting and finance professionals here. So how does this take us beyond the world of sports?
Yeah, so I think there's two prongs to that I might discuss. One is what companies are arising because of the sports betting industry. And a related part is what is the application of algorithms for sports betting elsewhere? So the first thing is, I mean, you can think about like a TV channel that broadcasts a sports game. What I've seen starting to blossom up is that in-game sports betting is occurring. And so halfway through a game, they may say, oh, would you want to place a bet on this player scoring 13 more points in an NBA game? And that's just a new opportunity to engage with fans. Alternatively, on the flip side, you can talk about how these algorithms that are being developed can be applied elsewhere. And I think, again, this interaction, this integration of machine learning and optimization, I see everywhere. For example, suppose you're looking at a telecommunication company. They have a ton of customers. Each customer, they have to decide what rate to charge them. And so what they have is a predictive model that takes as input, what is going to be the rate that I offer each one of my customers. And what they want to do is they want to optimize all of the rates across their entire portfolio of customers so that they can keep the most customers and be as profitable as possible. So, yeah, I mean, I see, just a lot of development in the world of how can new companies blossom up and take advantage of the real huge interest in sports betting, and then also how can you apply some of these algorithms elsewhere?
Jason, what are you seeing in terms of opportunities for finance professionals to skill up to take advantage of any opportunities here?
What we're starting to see in sports analytics world is that what's sort of bubbled up from the betting public, the gambling side, is actually starting to be used by teams in evaluating the players they have themselves. So I don't have a great tie-in necessarily specifically to the world of finance, but an understanding that there is sort of this synergy between the entertainment product that's being provided, that is the game itself, that is the sports contest, the baseball game, the football game, whatever, and the gambling operation. And it's actually helping in the long run the product on the field be better, because things that gamblers are understanding about how players interact and how players perform is helping teams readjust their strategies for evaluating players in the first place. So, I don't have a great tie-in, but as far as like how other businesses, other professions can think about how sports analytics can help them, is just an understanding that your operations may be improved by looking at outcomes, looking at analyses done outside of your operations themselves. So in other words, the teams didn't used to worry about insights of gamblers, and now I think they are starting to do that.
Talking about insights, of course, you can't have data without expecting to get some kind of insight from it, but the extent to which the data can be linked with particular insights about the individuals that data represents, that is a very important issue at the moment, especially because privacy and confidentiality are absolute priorities. So you must have some really good perspectives on some good practices for removing personally identifiable information from their data so that it's still usable. Jason, give us a sense of how a company can clean up the data it may already have so it's valid and it's usable without being a privacy risk.
So the most common strategy you might use is to have individual usernames basically just replaced by a random number. So in other words, instead of John Smith being the first line in your data file and his birthday and his educational outcomes or his healthcare information or whatever other private information is listed for him, you keep all that information about John Smith, but instead of saying John Smith, it says, random number 1. And then separately, in case you ever need to link that line of code in that database, that John Smith, to another file with John Smith and other information, you have to have some separate file that links the random numbers to the names themselves. And generally that file, sort of the code file that links back the names to the random numbers, you keep password protected and you keep it offline. So you would keep that on a flash drive. You wouldn't store that in the cloud. You wouldn't store that on a server. You would keep that completely separate. And that's the only link that you could then ever go back and see, hey, that's the information about John Smith, as opposed to just random person number one listed in the database.
So treat it differently in different contexts. It's a bit like betting, isn't it? Because that's also treated differently in different parts of the world. And I think from my perspective, I've always seen gambling as something that certainly when I was younger, it used to be fairly peripheral. But now as I'm getting old, I see attitudes changing. Things seem to be becoming more mainstream. Gamification is everywhere. It's even down to the random loot boxes that are so common in the online video games that I play. That's certainly a pretty universal reality in the virtual world. But what about things in the real world? David, what do you think the difference between the gambling and the betting industries there in the US are compared to how they are in the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about this, to be frank, but from my understanding, the original kind of acceptance of gambling was a bit more easy in other parts of the world outside of the US. But I do think that as daily fantasy sports has become more common, that has really changed. 43 out of the 50 states in the US allow daily fantasy sports betting online. Most of my friends participate in one way or another. And so I don't know if that, I would venture a guess that that's actually more prevalent here in the US than it is otherwise. But, we'd have to look into the data there. I don't have exact visibility into that.
Jason, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, before the 1960s, we didn't even have state lotteries here in the U.S. Gambling was very much a vice that was looked down upon in society, whereas now I think that's radically changed over just 2 generations. And whereas the rest of the world, I think, was a little bit ahead of the U.S. in allowing significant levels of gambling on game outcomes. So, will team A beat team B? The U.S. has very much taken the lead in this new area of daily fantasy sports, where you have basically all of the major U.S. sports with multiple different platforms here, allowing you to bet on basically individual player performances in games.
So talking about the changes that have happened in the gambling and the betting industry, certainly reflected by, and I know I did mention online and video gaming, we're certainly seeing this massive focus, not so much on things like daily fantasy sports, but esports. The video gaming world is just so different now compared to what it used to be. It's lucrative. It's massively popular. There are global esports or video gaming tournaments that get massive following online. And this is something which I think we saw in sports many years ago with the professionalization of sports and the tie-in with the entertainment industry and media rights and all that type of stuff. We've seen professional sports teams infusing their contests with gaming applications, apps, taking stuff online, gamifying everything. And with that comes opportunity. We know here in the UK, and we had a guest on our podcast a few months ago who'd been working almost exclusively with finance and accounting firms that were working within the entertainment industry. These are new models, new realities, new businesses, new sectors that are springing up, all of which have data and a need for accountants because they are making money. So my question to you, Jason, is where do you see these professional sports teams blending what they're doing with gaming applications in the future? Because it really is all changing, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that ties into the previous question just about how much the gambling industry has changed. So again, gambling used to be viewed much more negatively across society. Well, likewise, the professional sports organizations treated gambling at arm's length. You had, again, things like the NFL, the NBA, the MLB, these professional leagues in the U.S. really afraid of gambling. And you see historically with baseball, players suspended for life, even very good players suspended for life and not in the Hall of Fame because they gambled on games. And that's changing now. And so these leagues are starting to realize that they can create sort of a larger entertainment giant behemoth by infusing both gambling or just what you'd call like gaming applications with the actual sporting competition going on itself. So the NBA, one of the leaders in this area, they actually have MGM Resorts as its official gaming partner now. And so you're starting to see, and David alluded to this earlier in this podcast, you're starting to see advertisements across both across both businesses. So the NBA advertising for MGM to bet on NBA games, and MGM, by carrying bets for the NBA games, implicitly advertising for the NBA. But also you're starting to see non-monetary gaming applications come up, which are also going to increase interest, again, the entertainment product being offered. So you actually saw last year, this became pretty popular during the National Hockey League playoffs, where teams were offering their fans through an app that you downloaded on your phone, basically a set of questions about the game, about how certain players would perform. Very similar to what we see in daily fantasy sports, but it would be questions like, will John Smith score a goal tonight or not? And the fans would answer yes or no to these series of questions. And then the fans who performed the best, who say got all the questions right, won awards from the team. Stuff like signed team jerseys and tickets to future games. And it actually, all of the teams that did this, the St. Louis Blues were sort of the most well-known example, really think this improved interest. It drove interest both in the games themselves and in sort of the overall hockey landscape. So it's just another way to engage your fans, to get them to make sure they watch the game and have a really vested interest in it if they can win something from it other than the satisfaction of seeing their own team win. And so you mentioned earlier having people on in the past, accountants trying to handle issues coming up with businesses in the entertainment industry. This is almost a new asset that's being developed on the fly by these companies, these teams, that is driving more fan interest in their team. The best way to improve the market valuation of your team is the more fans you have. And if you can draw more people to having interest in your hockey team because of this other application you have where they can sort of wager, quote unquote, on what happens in that game, that's a huge asset to have.
And that's where APIs and the merging of data sets is so important these days, and where the analysis of that data by technology becomes so important, because there's so much of it that humans can't keep up. But the beauty is we don't have to. With data analytics, with robotic process automation, with different platforms out there, it means that the more these formerly distinct sectors, say entertainment, say sports, say betting, video games, etc., all of those are starting to come together in new ways and present new opportunities. That's why data analytics and the kind of stuff we're talking about in this interview becomes so important. Okay, so let's get ahead of the curve and look at what's coming up around the corner. The next disruption. David, what do you see as one big change that lies ahead, and how do finance professionals prepare for this?
Yeah, I think automated AI, artificial intelligence, is a huge thing that's coming in the very near future. So right now, finance firms, accounting firms, business operations firms, airlines, whatever, are hiring data scientists by the flock. And they are helping to build models which will be automated very soon. And so I think trying to figure out what to do with data scientists and very strong technical people will be a big challenge for finance firms and really all companies. And so I think that's one major change. And the other thing is the true integration of machine learning and optimization. Again, I mean, you're going to have automated AI. It's going to build these models robustly and quickly and really as accurate as could be. And then you're going to be able to make optimal decisions based on those models. And so I think that's going to be a really huge change. And I guess one more thing is always competitive. Trying to stay ahead of the curve is going to probably become increasingly difficult, as I see in sports gambling as well, right? I mean, trying to beat out all the other players day after day is becoming increasingly hard on daily fantasy sports because they've got the same models you have, right? So finding ways of kind of navigating that, I think, is something that's going to have to change.
Jason, what's your take on the next disruption? What do you see around the corner?
I think automating both the operations, the optimization aspect, and the predictive analytics aspect. That's the next step in, again, a broad field of analytics that can be applied to a number of different businesses.
Okay. And if you were to suggest that anyone interested in this topic should go online, look somewhere to find out about your work or perhaps more in the area of sports analytics, where would you point them online?
Yeah, so there's so many different topic areas of sports analytics. I think one of the best resources, and really what got me interested in this in the first place, is to read Football Outsiders. And so I believe their website is footballoutsiders.com. They were the first group that I ever became really interested in that started analyzing individual NFL players in a much more robust, data-driven way than our traditional statistics. So what they quickly realized was these sort of traditional NFL team statistics were very, very misleading about how good each team was at certain aspects. But sort of a higher level, one thing I would point to, there is a sports analytics conference that MIT's Sloan School of Business puts on. That is probably the gold standard for a sports analytics conference, both in that you get academics presenting work there. You get sports team officials. I mean, there's a lot of like general managers and owners of sports teams who are confirmed attendees for the upcoming year. You get a lot of other sort of team officials. So a lot of teams have analytics groups now. And so that's probably the best resource if you really want to get into this, is to attend that conference. And my website, again, if you search my name, University of North Alabama, you'll come to it. My papers are listed there. Again, some of them overlap with David's. That would be the best source, I guess.
Super. Well, we put links to all of that in our show notes. Now, I'll go back to David. David, we were talking about your Janus software. Tell us where people can find out more about that and the work you do.
Sure. So, I mean, you can always look me up on my website, my university website. It's just search David Bergman, UConn. As far as machine learning and optimization, there are several conferences dedicated to the topic. And I mean, particularly the Solver, the website is Janos, Janos, opt-operations.com. And so you can always check it out there. Email me. I'm always available. But yeah, the integration of machine learning and optimization, I think, is a field that I'm super interested in and is something that I'm doing actively.
So that takes us to the end of a very interesting and in-depth discussion, the most sporting conversation we've had on the Go Beyond Disruption podcast yet. And with so much to talk about, I don't think it'll be the last by any means. Jason, what's one message you'd like to leave for accounting and finance professionals that will help them go beyond disruption?
One thing that you see is some companies are realizing that even if they have good internal analytics teams, that sort of crowdsourcing their data analytics operations is a really great strategy. So, for example, Netflix has released a bunch of their data, and they're asking people to come up with the best predictive model for what future shows people would be interested in. And it's a significant competition in that they're offering a pretty hefty monetary prize for it. There's also I'm not sure if it's a company or it's just a subsidiary of Google, but something called Kaggle, which basically is a platform for other companies to release data with specific questions in mind. And remember, David mentioned that earlier, that having a focused question is really the goal here, not to just throw some data at an analyst and say, solve this for me, right? Well, solve what? So Kaggle allows you to basically dump internal data you have, propose a question that you need solved, and outsources it to the world of data scientists that are out there. Some who are at universities like David and I, and who have some extra research time on their hands and are interested in it, but also people who are just interested in working on fun problems in their basement. And they, again, offer incentives. You can win prizes, significant monetary prizes for doing really good modeling with this data that's available. So I'd sort of tie this all together in that historically, a lot of companies have thought of the data that they have as proprietary, as sort of personal to their business and an asset to sort of be hoarded. And I think going forward, a lot of companies need to think, you may not saying it's public data, it may be a little strong, but instead of just being purely private data that they're the only ones who can look at and touch and make decisions based on, that actually opening their data to the rest of the world, can give them a really big benefit, especially when you have things with outside interest. So, it may be hard for a trucking company to release their data and have anybody that interested in it. But in things like sports and entertainment and education and healthcare and important like public policy areas, yeah, you've got issues of de-identifying data and et cetera, but making that data available for the wider public is actually going to improve your own operations.
You never know where data is going to take your business. Treat it as an open resource. I think that's a great way to end our conversation today. Plenty more to explore about the topic of data analytics and about plenty of others. Look in the show notes to this episode and you'll see links to all the resources that David and Jason have mentioned. To view them, just click on your episode's info icon in the podcast app on your smartphone or your tablet, or open the episode in your computer's web browser to find everything right there at your fingertip. There are also 2 other websites we'd recommend for listeners interested in finding out more about data analytics. Go to arcpastore.com/go-beyond-disruption or cgmastore.com/go-beyond-disruption. Webinars, professional development resources, courses, all sorts of stuff to keep you ahead of the curve. Thanks again to our guests, David and Jason. And of course, thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, go tell someone about it. You can even email us using the feedback link in our show notes, because we'd love to know what you think and what you'd like to hear more of. From our London office, I'm Kyle Hannon. We'll be back soon with more conversations that help you and your profession to go beyond disruption. Till next time, goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at aicpa-cima.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein, and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.